But they, the Anunnaki, have only 46 chromosomes. How do we know that? Because we have 46 chromosomes. We descend from primates, and yet somehow we lose 2 whole chromosomes. That's an awful lot of DNA. And somehow we're so much better than them. We have 68 or something like that relative to them. But we don't. We have 46. So we know this was the result of the genetic engineering, and they had a problem. The Anunnaki did. What could they do? They had to, you know, how it works. There's 24 in sperm and egg, 23 sperm and egg. So you got to get the sperm and the egg to match up, one or the other, 23 or 24. Can you take out a chromosome from the creature of Earth, the 24, and still have a creature of Earth? No. Can you add a chromosome to yourself and still have an Anunnaki? Go up to 24 from 23? No. You got a real problem. It's an insoluble problem. And you need that because you got to get the first hybrid to get in the game of the genetic engineering. You got to get something alive that is a blending of you two to begin to work on it. So what can you do? How can you solve that problem? There's only one way, and boy, is it smart. You go in and you look and you compare the chromosomes, and you find 2 that can be fused and will take up one space but maintain the integrity of all the chromosomal material. You find a spot where you can fuse 2 to make 1, and now you've got all the material but taking up one place, and now you're ready to rock and roll. You with me? All right, let's look at the number 2 chromosome close up. They just went to the second one. They just looked down the row and they said, okay, this will work. Orangutan, 2 and 3. Gorilla, 2 and 3. Chimp, 2 and 3. Human. Uh-oh. Fusion. How long do you think it would take Mother Nature to do this? There's no clearer proof that we're genetically engineered just like they say we are. And so, I think it's fair to say that everything we know is wrong, at least about human origins, that we were given life by the gods with a small g through the equivalent of a test tube, and that we were the hair-covered hominoids, and that our humanity emerged from that. Now, this is where I normally end it, and they tell me I'm running out of time, so I want to get to the new thing that I want to share with you, because this is really exciting to me. Just recently, I received an email from a person who wants to remain anonymous, and this is what he said to me. He is a geneticist, a full-blown geneticist. And he says, "Dear Mr. Pye, I agree with your conclusions and will give you a few hints, if you wish, as a DNA deep throat. First, look up the huge discontinuities between man and the various apes for whole mitochondrial DNA, genes for the Rh factor, and human Y chromosomes, among others. Regarding number 3, the chromosomes, I refer you to K.D. Smith's 1987 study titled Repeated DNA Sequences of the Human Y Chromosome. It says most human Y chromosome sequences so far examined do not have homologs, which are similar sequences, on the Y chromosomes of other primates. Human female DNA does look somewhat ape-like, but not the male Y. This means that if we are a crossbred hybrid species, as you contend, meaning me, the cross had to be between a female ape-like creature, a creature of the earth, as the Sumerian said, and a male person from elsewhere, as I also contend." He goes on to say, "What the evolutionists do is find certain genes which look very similar between man and ape, then they make a tree of descent while ignoring those huge impassable abysses of difference elsewhere. Also, by certain methods of DNA dating, one can tell that numerous genes have been recently added to the human genome. If workers in my field were to say such things openly, we would be ostracized."
We're taught today by the Darwinians, or those who espouse the Darwinian theory, that life evolved from an initial pool of water with molecules in it that were basically inorganic, and that some way, sometime, somehow, those inorganic molecules were swept together into a living entity, something that was somehow alive. Now, we know that's not true now, and it's beginning to shift. The teaching is still the same because it takes a while to change the books, but it's becoming acknowledged that life almost had to be delivered to Earth, and the facts are incontrovertible that that's going to be the truth. When life first appears at around 4 billion years ago, the solar system itself is only about a half a billion years old, only about 500 million years old. Not really enough time for anything to develop because the Earth was still basically a seething ball of magma then. Very little land had actually cooled out, very little water would be available for anything to form in. The Darwin's warm pool, warm pond, couldn't possibly have existed when life first came. Not only did life come suddenly, at a time when it's just inexplicable that that would happen, it came in not one form but in 2 forms. Prokaryotic bacteria, there are 2 kinds. For a long time it was thought that there was just one kind, but there are actually 2. So you have suddenly, at around 4 billion years ago, 2 distinct separate kinds of prokaryotic bacteria appear on Earth as the first life forms. And those life forms were so complex and so complicated, even though they didn't have the nucleus of the eukaryotic bacteria, which came later, much later. Even though they didn't have cell nucleus, they're functioning to this day, because we have them to this day. Their functioning is so complex, so chemically complex, there's no doubt that it couldn't possibly have developed here. It had to have been delivered here, and it had to be delivered whole and intact, and it had to come at about 4 billion years ago. So given those facts right out of the box, there is no Darwinian development at the first stage of life as we understand it. Then as you move along through the history, Darwin postulated that from that beginning, however that beginning occurred, and he was no more clear on it than we were until just recently, however that beginning occurred, it had to develop very slowly but very regularly toward more and more complex beings, more creatures, however you care to term that. And as that slow gradual progression developed, ever more sophistication was put into the system by what he called natural selection, which is little traits that would somehow help a creature improve its odds of reproducing itself, would make for more and more and more sophisticated beings and creatures. And that's how we supposedly evolved, a word Darwin didn't use but which became popular later. We evolved from those bacteria through millions and millions and millions of slight improvements to creatures that were intermediate, the intermediate forms. And when Darwin put forth his theory in 1869, he said very clearly, if the intermediate forms that I'm postulating cannot be found, then my theory is wrong. He knew that there was a problem because even in his day it was clear in the fossil record that there were these huge gaps and then things would just suddenly appear. So he said, now that we know to look for them, we should find these intermediate species. We haven't found any really to this point. We do find development within species. We do find changes at the micro level, which is changes in parts. Darwin himself found the changes in the beaks of the finches, Darwin's finches, the shells of the tortoises that he found on the Galapagos. So he found indications of change at the micro level, at the part level. And what he postulated, what he extrapolated is, well, if we can see obvious change at the micro level, then we can legitimately assume that change also is going to occur at the macro level, at the whole body level, so that it will be possible for one species to change into, over time, another species entirely. And that was the bedrock of his theory. And again, he said, but if you can't find any transitional species where it's clear that one thing is turning into something else, or that thing is turning into something else yet again, there will be a problem. And that's been the result of much more detailed analysis of the fossil record. There are no intermediate species. Now, once scientists began to understand that and realize that what you saw was long periods of life existing in what is called stasis, which means the same. It basically stays the same. In the fossil record, you have these long periods of stasis followed by these periods of catastrophe where everything is just gone. It's wiped out. Not everything, but most everything. And then you have these periods of not much happening, and then suddenly the niches get filled up again very rapidly, these explosions of life forms. So when science in the 50s and 60s began to see what the reality of the situation was and how far it was from classic Darwinism, which they were already very heavily bought into because that's what they used to maintain the moral high ground against the creationists, they knew they had a problem. So Stephen Gould and some others came up with a theory called punctuated equilibrium. And what punctuated equilibrium says is that as life develops, there are catastrophes that wipe them out. It's pretty clear from the fossil record that these happen. There's been 5 major ones and several minor ones. In the major ones, you had wipeouts of life forms anywhere from 50% to 80%, 90% of all life forms wiped out. The first big one, the Permian, wiped out about 90% of the life forms that existed at that time. And yet, after this happens, the ecological niches are filled with new species that are suited to the new environment, whatever it is. So you have the catastrophe that changes everything, changes the atmosphere and changes the earth. Some things survive because they are adapted or are able to adapt themselves to the new environment. But then new species come in that are adapted to whatever that new environment is each time. Now, how does that happen? How can that happen? How can they rapidly fill in within a few thousand years all of the niches? Can evolution do that? No. There's no record. You would have to see it.
So you're suggesting there was, an exterior factor that used genetic manipulation or genetic engineering, and you mentioned that this is a recorded history, ancient recorded history of the Sumerians. So who are the Sumerians? What did they have to say? How did they record this?
The people who the Sumerians say came to Earth to do the genetic engineering that we've talked about are the Anunnaki. Right now, the Sumerians are considered to be the first great culture in the history of Earth as we understand it and accept it now. They seem to have come out of the Stone Age at around 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC. And they seem to have come out of the Stone Age and miraculously, virtually overnight, with no precedents whatever, created a very high civilization. In fact, they came up with over 100 of the firsts that we consider high culture. They had the first writing, the first language, the first cities, the first roads, the first laws, the first libraries, the first schools, the first music, the first literature, right on down the line. So they had the first of everything, basically, that counts. So how do you come out of the Stone Age and produce this miraculously advanced culture? How do you come down out of the highlands of the Crescent Valley, the Fertile Crescent rather, and settle into this valley, the valley of modern-day Iraq, the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, which is where the Sumerian culture arose, in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley of ancient times in modern day Iraq, and build this sophisticated culture with no base under you whatsoever. It absolutely defies belief. It boggles the mind. It shouldn't be. So what happens is historians, though they are very aware of it, tend to sort of leave them in the past and deal with the beginnings of history and culture with the Egyptians and the Greeks and the later Romans. That's sort of the sequence: Egyptians, Greeks, Romans. The Sumerians are very seldom talked about, very seldom dealt with, even though we have a tremendous amount of knowledge about them, because one of the things they developed first was writing, and one of the things that they stored that writing in was libraries. And their writing was done on clay tablets that were soft clay, and they used a stylus to write in what's called cuneiform, and then those would be fired in kilns, which is another invention of theirs, to turn it into stone. So they're very durable. So we have over 100,000 of these tablets have been recovered, most of which deal with the minutiae of everyday life, business deals, business transactions. Only about 5,000, as I understand it, dealing with the history of the culture and their literature and things like that. But of those 5,000 some odd tablets that we have, they tell an incredible story, the Sumerians do, of the Anunnaki, which is that there's another planet in our solar system, that gods, super beings, live on this planet, that these beings come to Earth for the specific reason of mining gold, which they need to repair their atmosphere on their planet, in the same way that we are damaging and destroying our own planet in our rise to a high civilization. Apparently the Anunnaki did the same thing on their planet. In their rise to a high civilization, they damaged their atmosphere, and they needed to replace it. Now, when our turn comes to repair our atmosphere, if we're not too late, the way we will almost certainly have to do it is to take gold, ironically enough, as finely as we can grind it up into pieces that are just infinitely small, so that they'll float above the atmosphere, and shoot them up into space and put them up there and let them disperse, because gold is a great reflector of cosmic rays. And it's, of course, an insulator, but that's why you see gold sheathing on the visors of astronauts, and why gold is in the satellite, in the capsules, the space capsules, to shield from cosmic rays. So that's what the Anunnaki said they had to do. Now, it's amazing to me that here are the Sumerians writing 4,000 years ago, saying these things that we are only just now beginning to realize ourselves we're going to have to do one day. So for whatever it's worth, they say the Sumerians say that the Anunnaki said they came to Earth to get the gold, and they did that. So they were here. They came at around 400,000 years ago, and they lived here for quite some time, just simply panning gold out of the rivers. It's called placer mining, and placer mining is the way we mine today when we can. It's the easiest way to do it. But over time, everything taps out. So when the Tigris-Euphrates Valley tapped out, they had to move elsewhere. And so they, by then, because they were a flying civilization, they had found the mother lode in southern Africa. To this day, the mother lode of gold on Earth is South Africa. So they divided themselves up. They left half of themselves, and there were only about 600 of them at maximum, because they had to shuttle in from their planet, Nibiru. And so their 600 they divided up. Some stayed in the home base, the original home base, the Eden, and the other group moved down to the underworld, the lower world, which was southern Africa, to do the mining. And they didn't like to mine. It was hard work. It wasn't like just putting trays in water and collecting the gold out every 2-3 weeks. They had to dig it out. They didn't like doing it. So they revolted. And they said, the Anunnaki did, to their leaders, we don't want to do this anymore. So the leader said, all right, we'll make you a slave. We'll make you a servant. And that's the reason, the impetus, according again to the Sumerian writings, for the creation of human beings. To me, this makes perfect sense. If I was a superior being from another planet and I came to Earth, or anywhere, and I suddenly found myself having to do extremely difficult work, and there was another being that could be somehow genetically manipulated to turn into a slave and a servant, I would do it. And I think that they did. And I think it matches the genetic evidence that we have of what happened to us. I think the reasoning is logical. It makes sense. It may not be true. It could turn out to not be true. But why would the Sumerians leave anything even hinting at these things? Where would they get that kind of... You couldn't have that creativity at that period of time, because space travel wouldn't even be an option to them. They wouldn't even think of it. Flying, maybe not even gold mining. I mean, these are people that are just scratching for a living, supposedly, and then suddenly they're developing this culture and they're digging gold and do all that. It doesn't make sense. So I in the absence of any evidence that's compelling to the contrary, I consider the Sumerian tablets to be extremely compelling. But because it so challenges the standard accepted theories of human origins, the Darwinian theory, when scholars deal with that information, they simply ignore it. They just put it off into what they call the myth pile. They just say, that has to be myth because it can't be true. And if it can't be true, there's myth and there's truth. Not truth, got to be myth. And so it's just simply discarded information. By going into that myth pile and looking at it and treating it as real and formulating a whole scenario that explains, I think, in much more accurate terms, for whatever degree they might be wrong, they are infinitely more accurate and factual than is the Darwinian theory of our evolution. That's absolute garbage. That is just total junk. and will be recognized as such in the not too distant future as we keep opening up our genes, and it begins to face us more and more that we are we're created. Then we're going to start looking for, well, who would have created us? And the answer's been sitting there all along for 4,000 years. It's just that the establishment doesn't want to look at the truth right now. But it's my job and the job of people like me to get this word out, and we're going to be standing on the right side when this is over. There is going to be a reckoning one day, and the truth is going to come out. And this is going to be infinitely closer to the truth, if not exactly the truth in all of its points. It's much closer to the truth than what we're taught right now, for sure.